Kale woke up because the iron inside his forearm began to ache. A dull, pulling pain, a harbinger of a frequency shift. He lay on a narrow shelf in the technical niche of car 702. Above his head, beyond layers of steel plating, the wind of the wasteland howled. The train Jericho was running at the limit of its speed. 40 kilometers of armored cars cut through the gray fog. Kale raised his right hand. The matte black metal of the prosthetic seemed alien in the dim light of the cabin. The artificial tendons contracted almost imperceptibly in rhythm with the heartbeat of the great spire. Time to get up. He descended to the floor. Try not to make noise. In the adjacent compartment, other listeners slept. Shadows of people whose ears had been burned by resonance back in childhood. Kale was the only one who could hear silence. He stepped into the corridor. The walls of the car here were coated with a layer of soot and oil. It smelled of burnt insulation and cheap synthetic broth. "Hey, mute," Foreman Gorn called out to him. A heavy-set man with a copper resonator sewn directly into his throat. "Off to the roof again? Watch out. The Psalmsingers are mean today. There's some celebration in the first car. The goal will be double strength." Kale only nodded. He didn't like to speak, even by gestures. "Go on," Gorn waved his hand. "Just strap yourself in properly. If you fall off, nobody's going to break for one listener." Expendable material. Kale moved toward the hatch at the end of the car. The path to the roof was familiar. A ladder of rungs, cold metal, a pull, and there he was outside. The wind instantly struck him in the chest, trying to throw him off the rushing Hulk. Kale crouched, activated the magnetic clamps in his soles. The world around was gray, an endless plain strewn with the bones of old cities. And spires, black, smooth needles jutting from the earth every 100 miles. They didn't merely stand. They breathed. Kale pressed the palm of his prosthetic to the plating. The sound of the train passed through the metal into his nervous system. Tum-dum, tum-dum. This was the life rhythm of the Jericho. But today there was a false note in it. A creak somewhere around the 500th cars. Friction that shouldn't be there. He crawled forward, against the wind. 10 cars later he saw her. Lyra was sitting on the edge of the brake platform, her legs dangling into the void. In her hands, a violin of dark wood, covered with silver protective signs. She didn't look back. She knew it was him. His silence was recognizable. "Do you hear it?" she asked without turning around. Kale sat down beside her, placed his hand against her cheek. The skin was cold. "They're accelerating," Lyra continued. "The Sound Council decided to shorten the cycle. They want to pass the Great Junction before storm season begins. But Jericho won't withstand such a frequency. The rust is already eating the brake pads at the rear." Kale looked at the horizon. There, in the haze, the silhouette of the second spire was already taking shape. It was called the Whispering One. "My father used to say that once people lived on the ground," Lyra said quietly. "Without trains, without this eternal running. They just stood in one place and looked at the stars." Kale smiled bitterly to himself. To stand in one place meant becoming empty within 40 minutes. The noise of the spires erased memory, then personality, and then turned flesh into cold metal. Suddenly the air above the train trembled. It had begun. The first wave of the gull struck from above. It was not a sound, a physical weight. Kale was pressed against the roof. Lyra raised her violin. The bow danced across the strings. She was creating a tiny acoustic shield around them. But the gull of the Whispering One was different. Within it, voices could be heard, distorted, stretched, full of pain. Kale felt his prosthetic begin to heat up. The black metal turned dark crimson. Images flashed in his mind. Not his, someone else's. A woman rocking a cradle. An old man reading a book under a lamp. A boy running through green grass. These were data. The spires held within them erased lives. They were not prisons. They were hard drives of a dying civilization. "Kale!" Lyra cried out. Blood began to flow from her ears. The shield of the violin began to crack. He understood what he had to do. He stood up to his full height, ignored the pressure, raised his right hand to the sky, directly toward the invisible beam of the spire. Kale became a lightning rod. All the noise meant for the 700th cars began to flow into his prosthetic. It was painful, as though molten lead was being poured into his veins. His body arched. The black metal of his arm began to expand, absorbing the energy, processing it into pure, cold silence. A minute later, it was all over. The gull subsided. The spire was left behind. Kale collapsed onto the boards of the roof. He was breathing heavily. His right arm still glowed crimson. Lyra crawled toward him. With trembling hands, she wiped the blood from his face. "What have you done?" she whispered. Kale took her hand. He could not speak, but he sent her an impulse. The feeling of green grass and sunlight. Lyra froze. Her eyes widened. This was a noise, she asked. "They're alive in there, inside." Kale nodded. He understood the true purpose of the train. The sound council in the first car was not simply saving people. They were using survivors as biological filters. The train would pass by the spires. People would absorb part of the noise, cleanse the data, which was then collected by the golden vessels of the aristocracy. They were not passengers. They were sewage treatment plants. "We need to go to the first car," said Lyra. Her voice had grown stronger. "If the data is there, if people can be brought back, we have to do it." Kale looked at her, then at his right hand. The prosthetic had stopped aching. Now it hummed low and steady, like an engine that had finally been fueled with the right fuel. He stood up, helped Lyra to her feet. For the first car was 40 kilometers. 40 kilometers of locked doors, psalm singers, and traps. "Let's go," said Kale. That rough, mechanical voice again. They began their journey. They walked along the rooftops. The wind tore at their clothes. The metal hummed beneath their feet. In the 650th car, they were waited for. 3 figures in white robes, inquisitors of sound, each holding a heavy resonator staff. On their faces were masks of polished brass. "Stop, mute," said the eldest. His voice through the mask sounded like the grinding of metal. "You have absorbed the psalm of the Whispering One. That is theft of divine energy. The sentence is annihilation." The inquisitors raised their staves. The air between them began to glow blue. Kale did not stop. He simply walked forward. Lyra raised her violin. She played one short, sharp note, a dissonance. The blue glow wavered. Kale raised his right hand, opened his fist. A wave of absolute silence struck the inquisitors. Their staves did not explode. They simply crumbled into gray dust. The masks cracked. The inquisitors fell to their knees. They gasped for air with open mouths. In a vacuum Kale had created, there was no oxygen. They walked past them, without looking back. Kale felt that with each sound he absorbed, he was losing something human. The skin on his shoulder began to harden, taking on the gray shade of rust. That is the price, he thought. For truth, one always pays with flesh. Hours passed. The train plunged into tunnels, surfaced under acid rains. In a 500th car, they descended inside. It was quieter here, and more frightening. These were storage cars. Here, in capsules, lay those who had not endured the gull. The empty, thousands of bodies covered in a layer of organic metal. They were not dead. They were in standby mode. Lyra stopped at one of the capsules. "That's my brother," she said quietly. "He was taken 3 years ago. They said he had become part of the Great Harmony." Kale approached, placed his hand on the glass of the capsule. The prosthetic responded instantly. Encrypted file detected identity. Auditor, Sector 702 status. Archive. Kale looked at Lyra. He understood. The empty were not defects. They were external storage media, bodies into which the Sound Council recorded cleansed data. He clenched his fist. The metal of the prosthetic creaked. "They're not just thieves," he thought. "They're farmers, and we are the harvest. We need to hurry." He gestured to Lyra. They reached the junction of the 400th and 300th cars. Here the border began, a heavy hermetic door, guarded not by people, but by automatons, enormous machines that operated on the frequency of death. Anyone who came within 10 meters without a pass simply disintegrated into atoms from the vibration. Kale stopped. "Lyra," he said, "stay here." "No, it's dangerous. Your violin won't withstand their frequency." I'm not leaving, Kale. He looked into her eyes. Stubborn. Full of tears. All right, but stay behind me. Kale began to transform the prosthetic. The plates separated, revealed a pulsating core. He began to generate anti-hurts. The automatons stirred. Their lenses flared red. The sonic cannon of the first robot fired. Kale did not absorb it. He struck back. Two waves met. The space between them distorted. The air turned violet. A crack rang out that shattered the glass of the empty capsules. Kale walked forward, slowly. With each step, his boots left dents in the steel floor. The prosthetic smoked. The skin on Kale's chest began to char. Lyra played. Her music was like a thin needle piercing the powerful shield of the automatons. She found the weak points in their code, showed Kale the way. A minute later, it was all over. The automatons froze. Molten metal poured from their joints. The door to the 300th sector opened. It was different. Clean. Bright. It smelled of flowers. Artificial ones, but still flowers. The aristocracy. People in silk clothing looked at them with horror. For them, Kale and Lyra were dirty ghosts from nightmares. Where is the magistral? Kale asked the first person he met. A man in a golden mask pointed forward with a trembling hand. There, in the first car. But the pontiff will destroy you. You are silence in the temple of music. We are the truth you try to drown out, said Lyra. They ran. Past theaters. Past restaurants. Past gardens that had never known real sunlight. Ahead was the first car. The golden locomotive. The entrance was guarded by Valeri, the conductor of the train. She stood on the bridge. In her hands, a thin conductor's baton made of sleeper's bone. I've been waiting for you, mute, she said. You are the most perfect instrument we have ever created. A pity it will be necessary to break you. She raised her baton. The whole Jericho shuddered. The music of the train changed. It became aggressive, tearing. Kale felt his prosthetic begin to resist. The system inside the arm was trying to submit to the conductor. External control detected core breach. Attempt. Kale fell to his knees. He grabbed his right arm. It was jerking, trying to strike him himself. Lyra, run. No. She pressed the violin to her shoulder. But she did not play her usual music. She sang. A human voice. Without filters. Without resonators. Quiet. Trembling. Valeri laughed. You think your pitiful voice will drown out the symphony of the train? But Lyra's voice was not trying to drown anything out. It was entering into resonance with Kale. Kale raised his head. His left human hand gripped his right mechanical one. The truth is not in the noise, he whispered. The truth is in what we feel. He stood up. His prosthetic suddenly turned white. Radiant. It absorbed Lyra's voice, amplified it billions of times. It was not sound. It was light. Valeri screamed. Her baton flared and burned. The golden locomotive began to fall apart. Kale approached the main resonator, an enormous organ that governed the fate of the world. He placed both hands on the keys. Formatting initiated rang out in the silence. The data came flooding back. All throughout the train, the capsules began to open. The empty opened their eyes. The rust fell away from their bodies. They remembered their names, their homes, their lives. The train Jericho began to slow down. We're going to stop, Lyra whispered, approaching Kale. Yes, and we won't become empty? No, we will become people. The train came to a halt. Silence fell over the world. True silence, in which one can hear the breath of the wind. Kale and Lyra stepped out onto the balcony of the first car. Before them was a valley, with green grass, with real trees. The spires on the horizon stood dark and dead. Kale looked at his hand. The prosthetic was slowly turning into ordinary metal, stripped of magic, stripped of pain. He looked at Lyra. Thank you, he said. She smiled. Let's go home, Kale. They descended from a train, stepped on a living ground. Behind them, thousands of people were coming out. They were no longer running. They had returned. Kale and Lyra took their first step through the grass. It was coarse, soaked with the salt of the old world, but alive. Behind them, the giant corpse of the Jericho stood still. 40 kilometers of steel that no longer breathed. Thousands of people poured out of the cars. They stood on the embankment, blinded by real light. The pontiffs in their golden masks huddled at the doors, covering their faces with their hands. Their world of sound privileges had crumbled in a fraction of a second. Kale felt the vibration of the earth entering his boots. This was not the gull. This was the deep, calm breathing of the planet. "Look," Lyra whispered. She pointed to the horizon. There, where the whispering spire had once towered, a cloud of dust was now settling. Without the sustenance of human echo, the black needles had begun to collapse. They had been parasites that fed on fear. Now the host was gone. Suddenly a man ran out from the crowd. He was in the rags of a listener, his face covered with scars from acoustic burns. He fell to his knees, scooped up a handful of earth, and began to laugh. Loudly, brokenly. It was the first human emotion not passed through a resonator filter. Kale turned back to the train. In the doorway of the first car, Valeria appeared. Her silk dress was torn, her face pale, stripped of its mask makeup. She clutched a fragment of her conductor's baton in her hands. "You have destroyed everything," she rasped. Her voice, without amplifiers, was weak and pitiful. "We have no food, no water filters. We will die here within a week." The people from the lower cars began to slowly turn toward her. In their eyes, there was no hatred, only the infinite, icy emptiness of those who had been used as fuel for 300 years. Gorn, the foreman of the 7th sector, stepped forward. He tore the copper resonator from his throat, threw it into the dust. "We will learn," he said, in his own real voice. "And you can stay in your golden cages until they rust away completely." Kale felt Lyra squeeze his palm. Her fingers were trembling, but her grip was firm. "We need to find water, Kale. Real water. That doesn't smell of oil." He nodded. He raised his right hand. The prosthetic no longer pulsed. It had become simply a heavy piece of iron attached to his body. Dead weight. Kale found a sharp fragment of rail on the ground, fallen during the emergency braking. He placed his arm on a steel boulder. "What are you doing?" Lyra cried out. He did not answer. He struck the fragment against the connecting bolts of the elbow joint. Once, sparks flew to the sides. Twice, the metal screeched. 3 times, the prosthetic fell with a dull thud into the grass. Kale exhaled. The wound on his shoulder was old, sealed with skin back in the council's laboratories, but now it burned. He bound the stump with a piece of his jacket. "Now I am truly mute," he thought. "But at least I am free." They headed north, away from the railway, away from the past. By evening, they had reached the foot of a hill. The air here was cleaner. Lyra found a stream. It pushed through the stones, clear and cold. She drank for a long time, gulping, and then splashed water in Kale's face. He laughed, silently, just shaking with his whole body. They lit a fire. Others began to gather around. Lubricators, workers, even a pair of junior psalmsingers who had torn off their robes. Everyone sat in silence, staring at the fire. In the silence, Lyra took out her violin. Its body was cracked, one string broken. She drew the bow across the remaining 3. This was not the music of a Jericho. It was the sound of wind in dry grass, the sound of water beating against stones, the sound of silence that no longer kills. People began to hum along. At first, they simply droned in tune. Then words appeared. Old, forgotten songs that had been passed in whispers in the holds of the train. Kale looked at the sky. There, through thinning clouds, stars were visible. Small, distant points. He understood that the spires had not only erased memory. They had closed the sky. They had created a dome of noise so that people would never look up. Suddenly, Lyra stopped. She listened. "Do you hear it?" she asked. Kale froze. From far away, from the direction of the mountains, a sound came. It was not the gull. It was a long, powerful roar. "Animals," someone at the fire whispered. "No," said Kale. "Life." He stood up, added branches to the fire. Tomorrow would be hard. They would have to build homes from the wreckage of the old world. Would have to learn to plant seeds in this salty ground. Would have to bury those who had not lived to see this day. But when Kale lay down to sleep on the hard ground, for the first time in 20 years, he did not hear the aching of iron in his arm. He heard only the beating of his own heart. And it sounded right. In the morning, Kale woke first. The snow that had fallen in the night was beginning to melt. In the fog that had wrapped around the valley, he saw a figure. It was Valeri. She stood 100 meters from their camp, alone, without her retinue. She came closer. In her eyes was emptiness. "Help me," she said. "I don't know how to breathe this air. It's too empty." Kale looked at her delicate, pampered hands, then at his own calloused, scarred. He held out to her an old machete knife, pointed to the dry branches of the shrubs. "Chop," he indicated by gesture. "We will build." Valeri looked at the knife, then at Kale. She took the tool. Her hand trembled, but she did not let go. The hierarchy of sound had finally died. The hierarchy of labor was beginning. Weeks passed. The camp by the stream had turned into a small settlement. People dismantled the cars of the Jericho, hauling sheets of metal on their backs. They built huts, reinforced the walls. Kale became the architect of this chaos. He could not hear frequencies, but he felt structure. He knew how to join the beams so that the wind would not knock them down. Lyra taught the children, but not music. She taught them to listen to the world, to tell the rustle of a snake in the grass from the sound of approaching rain. One day, Kale found an old map in the wreckage of the seventh car. A real paper map, which Gorn had been hiding. On it was marked the shore of a sea, only 3 days' journey away. He showed it to Lyra. "Let's go," she said at once. "We have to see it." They left the settlement to Gorn, took small provisions of food, and headed east. The wasteland was changing. The rust was disappearing, giving way to moss and lichen. The air was becoming damp and heavy. At the end of the 3rd day, Kale felt it. Sound. A low, rumbling bass. It did not stop for a single second. "It's a spire," Lyra whispered in horror. Kale listened. He closed his eyes. "No, the frequency is different. It doesn't press down. It calls." They climbed to the last dune. Before them lay infinity. A blue, churning mass of water. Waves rolled onto white sand, breaking into foam with a sound that Kale could never have imagined. It was the sea. Lyra fell onto the sand. She was laughing and crying at the same time. "It's so loud, Kale. It never falls silent." Kale stepped in the water up to his knees. Icy foam licked his legs. He looked at the horizon. There were no towers there. No trance. Only the sun, slowly sinking into the water. He cupped a handful of salty water. Looked at his reflection. In his eyes, there were no longer the violet sparks of the system. Only weariness and peace. He turned to Lyra. She was sitting on the sand, pressing the violin to her chest. "We are home, Lyra." She nodded. "Here we will build a big house, and a lighthouse, so that others will know where to go." Kale sat down beside her. He watched the waves. He understood why the spire had not been able to destroy him, why his silence had proved stronger. The sound of machines was artificial. The sound of the spires was a lie, and the sound of the sea was truth. Against truth, no resonator will help. They sat there until dark. They listened to how the ocean speaks with the shore. Somewhere far behind, deep in the continent, 40 kilometers of rusty metal of the Jericho were gradually sinking into the earth. Nature was taking back what was hers. In 100 years, children will not know what white noise is. They will think that railways are simply strange scars on the body of the earth. Kale closed his eyes. He was no longer mute. He simply had nothing more to say. The world had said everything for him. Kale woke from the cold. The sand beneath him had grown what the tide had begun. He opened his eyes and saw the first rays of sunlight breaking apart in the endless water. Lyra was sleeping, curled up, pressing the violin to herself like the only surviving soul from the old world. Kale rose carefully. The stump of his right arm ached from the sea damp, but it was a living, honest pain. He walked along the water's edge. Foam licked his bare feet. Suddenly, he noticed something strange. Among the seaweed and wood fragments cast up by the sea, gold gleamed. Kale bent down. It was a resonator, a small, elegant device from the first car, inlaid with stones. Apparently, one of the aristocrats had thrown it out of the window of the train on the very day of the catastrophe. He picked it up. The device was dead. Its innards had been packed with sand and salt. Kale turned it in his hands, a symbol of power that people had once been killed for. Now it was simply rubbish. Beautiful, gleaming rubbish. He swung back and hurled the resonator into the deep. The gold glinted in the sun and disappeared beneath a wave. Without a splash, without a sound, "Kale," Lyra called. She had already woken and was sitting on the dune, rubbing her eyes. He turned. He pointed east. There, beyond the ledge of a cliff, he saw smoke. A thin gray thread rising into the sky. "Not our camp," Lyra whispered, coming up beside him. "Too far away." "Then we're not alone," said Kale. They moved toward the smoke. They walked along the shore until the sand gave way to sharp black stones. Around the bend, a bay opened up. There stood a settlement. Dozens of huts built not from the steel of the train, but from white driftwood and whale bones. Nets were drying on the shore. Small boats rocked on the waves. The people here looked different. Their skin was dark from the sun, their hair bleached white. On their necks there were no scars from resonators. They had no marks of the system at all. "Savages?" asked Lyra, instinctively gripping the violin. Kale shook his head. These people had lived here always. While the Jericho cut circles along the iron roads, considering itself the sole stronghold of civilization, another life had flowed here. A life that had never known the spires. From the nearest hut came an old man. He was enormous, with a beard down to his waist. He looked at Kale, then at his empty sleeve, then at Lyra's violin. "You've been traveling a long time," said the old man. His voice was thick as the rumble of the surf. "You knew about the train?" asked Kale. The old man smiled. "We heard it every spring, when the wind blew from the plains. The grinding of iron on iron. We called it the Dance of Fools. You ran in circles, afraid to stop, while the world was waiting for you all this time." Lyra came closer. "But the spires, the gull, how did you survive?" The old man pointed to the sea. "It sings louder than any tower, daughter. Salt eats away at their frequencies. Water is the great absorber. If you live by the ocean, a spire is no louder than a fly to you." Kale bowed his head. 300 years of slavery. 300 years of fear of silence. And all they had needed to do was go to the water. "Come," said the old man. "We have a good catch today. We will eat fish. Real fish. Not from a vat." They sat at the campfire of the people of the sea. They ate hot food that smelled of smoke. Kale listened to their stories. About whales that sing underwater. About storms that wash the rust from the soul. About stars by which they find their way in the dark. Lyra took out the violin. She played a melody she had composed in the night. The people of the sea fell silent. They listened, their heads tilted. When she finished, the old man nodded. "There is much iron in your music, daughter, but there is also wind. Leave the iron here on the shore. Let the sea take it." In the evening, Kale sat on the pier. He watched as Lyra taught the local children to hold the bow. She was laughing, with real, pure laughter. He understood that the Jericho had truly died, not when he pulled the lever at the junction, but now, in this bay, among people who cared nothing for psalms and resonance. Kale looked at the stump of his arm. He no longer felt like a cripple. In this world, where one had to haul nets and chop wood, he would find his place. He would build a house here. For himself. For Lyra. For those who would still come from the train. He stood up and went to Lyra. "Tomorrow we go back for the others?" she asked, seeing him. Kale nodded. "We will bring them here. All want to come. And those who stay in the cars? The pontiffs? Valeri? Let them listen to their rust," said Kale. "Their time is up." They stood on the shore, two ghosts of the old world who had found flesh. The wind from the sea blew in their faces, wiping away the last traces of nano dust from their clothing. The spire of silence on the horizon finally crumbled. Its last summit fell into the sea, raising a fountain of spray. Nobody even turned to look, because silence was no longer empty. It was full of life. Kale put his arm around Lyra's shoulders. They looked at the stars, the very ones they had previously seen only in the noise. Now they were real, cold, beautiful, and they were silent. And that was the finest thing about them. The following morning, Kale and Lyra left the fishing settlement. The old man gave them dried fish and a flask of fresh water to take along. He did not say goodbye, simply nodded in farewell. He knew they would return. The way back to the train seemed shorter. The wasteland no longer frightened Kale. Without the rumble of diesel engines and the howling of the spires, the world had gained volume. He heard the rustle of sand, the whistle of wind in hollow stones, and his own breathing. When the steel carcass of the Jericho appeared on the horizon, Kale stopped. 40 kilometers of rusty iron looked like the skeleton of a prehistoric beast washed up on shore. In the camp by the stream, work was in full swing. Gorn and his men had dismantled the plating of 2 cars and were building something like a community house from them. But the atmosphere was heavy. "Kale," Lyra called out, running up to the fire. Gorn raised his head. His face was gray with exhaustion. "Good that you came back," he said hoarsely. "We have trouble. The pontiffs have barricaded themselves in the first car. They've started the emergency generators and are broadcasting the frequency of hunger." Kale frowned. He knew that signal. Low-frequency infrasound that caused panic, nausea, and slow madness. The aristocracy did not want to leave quietly. If they could not rule the world, they had decided to turn it into hell. "People cannot work," Gorn continued. "Children are crying. Old people are going mad. Valeri, she has taken charge of them. She says that if we don't return to the cars and acknowledge the authority of the council, they will burn our brains out with this sound." Kale looked at the first car. It gleamed gold in the rays of the setting sun. From the enormous resonators on the roof of the locomotive came a barely perceptible shimmer. The air trembled with tension. Lyra clenched her fist. "They will not stop until they have killed everything human in us." Kale walked over to a pile of tools. He chose a heavy sledgehammer. He looked at his left hand. It was strong, but one hand was not enough for what he had in mind. "Gorn," he gestured toward the sledgehammer and then toward the first car. Gorn nodded. He understood. They assembled a squad. 30 people. Lubricators with heavy wrenches, stokers with crowbars. People who had spent their whole lives feeding this steel monster, and now were going to kill it. They walked in silence. The frequency of hunger beat against their nerves. Kale felt everything inside him tighten, felt nausea rising. But within him the shadow of silence still lived. He imagined the sea, the crash of waves that erases any lie. They approached the hermetic hatch of the locomotive. From the speakers above the door came Valeri's voice. "Go away, slaves. This train is a shrine. Without us you are nothing. We are the voice of God." Kale did not listen. He pointed Gorn to the hinges of the hatch. "Strike," he ordered by gesture. The blows of the sledgehammers rang out in a rhythm that no resonator could drown out. The rhythm of living fury. The steel groaned. Sparks flew into the darkening sky. Finally, the upper hinge snapped. The hatch warped. Kale inserted a crowbar into the gap, threw his full body weight against it. The others joined him. With a wild screech, the door flew inward, opening a passage into the sterile, ozone-scented paradise of the aristocracy. Inside it was bright. Guards in white uniforms tried to raise their shields, but they had no power from the spires. Their staves emitted only a pitiful squeak. The lubricators crushed them in a minute. It was not a battle, it was the reckoning of reality with illusion. Kale walked to the control cabin. He burst inside and saw Valeri. She was sitting in the pilot's seat, her fingers running across the touchpad, increasing the power of the gull. "Stop!" she screamed, seeing Kale. "You will destroy the last technology of this world. We can restore the system. We can launch the spires again." Kale approached her. He felt no hatred, only a deep revulsion. He took her by the shoulder and simply shoved her away from the console. Valeri fell onto the carpet, her golden diadem rolling across the floor. Kale looked at the main resonator crystal. It pulsed with a toxic violet light. He raised the sledgehammer. "No!" Valeri shrieked. The blow landed squarely in the center of the crystal. A sound rang out like the cry of 1,000 shattering mirrors. A blinding flash and darkness fell over the locomotive. The frequency of hunger cut off. Kale stood in silence. His ears were ringing, but it was a blessed silence. He stepped out onto the balcony of the locomotive. Below, on the ground, hundreds of people had frozen. They were looking up. When they understood that the sound was gone, A single, powerful sigh of relief rose over the valley. Kale looked at Valeri. She was sitting on the floor with her face in her hands. "Go," he said to her. "Go to the stream. If you want to live, work. If you want power, look for it in the rust." The following morning, they began to dismantle the Jericho in earnest. This was not mere looting. It was recycling. From the golden panels of the first car, they made tableware. From the armor plows. From the wires nets. A month later, Kale led the first group to the sea. 100 people, the strongest, the bravest. Lyra walked ahead, playing on her violin. Her music sounded different now. There was more space in it, more salt. They reached the bay. The people of the sea greeted them like old acquaintances. The old fisherman set aside a plot of land for them beneath the mountain. Construction of the lighthouse began that same day. Kale laid the foundation himself. He used the main engine block of the train, the most durable part in the world. Now it did not turn wheels. It held stones on the shore. A year passed. The settlement in the bay had grown. Now there were 300 houses here. On the top of the cliff, the fire of the lighthouse burned. But this was not a magical light. It was an ordinary fire, which the listeners kept going every night, taking turns standing watch in the tower. Kale sat on the porch of his house. The house was small, but from its window the sea was visible. His left hand had become muscular and rough. He had learned to do everything one-handed: chop firewood, mend nets, hold Lyra by the waist when they walked along the shore. "Kale," Lyra called from the house. "Come and eat." He got up, but lingered on the threshold. On the horizon, he saw a dot. It was slowly approaching. It was a sail, a small boat built from sheets of aviation aluminum found somewhere in the wasteland. "Another group," Kale whispered. With each passing month, more and more people came to the lighthouse. Those who had not been afraid to leave the rusty belly of the train. Those who had chosen silence over the safety of noise. Kale descended to the pier. He helped those who arrived to step onto the sand. They looked just as he had once looked, frightened, pale, with trembling hands. "Welcome home," he told them. His voice had grown softer, almost human. In the evening, they gathered in the square. Lyra played while the children danced on the sand. Even Valeri was there. She now worked at the salt works. Her skin had tanned, and something resembling life had appeared in her eyes. Kale looked at the fire of the lighthouse. He knew that the world was still full of dangers, that somewhere in the depths of the continent other trains still stood, that the spires might wake again one day. But now they had something they had not had for 300 years. They had soil beneath their feet, and the right to be silent when they wished. Kale took Lyra by the hand. They looked at the sea. The waves whispered to them of the future. And in that whisper, there was not a single false note. The world was vast. The world was hard. But the world was theirs. Kale took a step forward. The air around the spire octave was thick as syrup. Every breath came with difficulty. The lungs seemed to fill with liquid glass. The blue glow of the tower pulsed in the rhythm of a slowed heartbeat. Valeri stood on a dais assembled from fragments of old resonators. Her fingers were intertwined in the air as though she were holding invisible threads stretching up to the summit of the monolith. "You are too late. Mute," she repeated. Her voice no longer trembled. It vibrated on a frequency that made the teeth ache and Kale's pupils dilate. "We have found a true tuning fork." The spires were not breaking the world. They were waiting for worthy conductors. Lyra raised her violin. The bow struck the strings, driving out a sharp, dirty sound. It was not music, it was acoustic noise, intended to tear apart the harmony of the octave. 3 pontiffs in foil robes raised their hands simultaneously. From their palms burst concentrated beams of ultrasound. The air between them and Lyra boiled, turning into a white haze. "Kale!" Lyra cried, barely keeping her balance. "She's weakening. I can't hold the shield much longer." Kale looked at his left hand. Strong, human, but useless against pure resonance. He shifted his gaze to the place where the prosthetic had once been. The scars on his shoulder suddenly began to burn with cold fire. There, deep in the tissues, nanothreads remained, neural connections that no rail fragment had been able to tear out. Kale closed his eyes. He stopped fighting the sound. He allowed the melody of oblivion to enter him. Before his inner vision fractals began to spin. Blue, I see patterns. He felt his consciousness begin to split apart, turning into pure information. External signal detected. Type euphoria warning. System critical failure reintegration attempt. Kale took another step. Valeri frowned. She waved her hand, and the octave wailed. The sound became physical. Kale was thrown backward. The skin on his face split. A thin trickle of blood ran down. Dance, Valeri screamed. Dance until your bones turn to sand. Kale rose. He was not looking at her. He was looking into the very depths of the spire. There, behind the black obsidian, a heart of liquid crystal was beating. He understood. The error of the creators was not in the code. It was in the absence of silence. They had wanted endless sound, forgetting that music exists only where there are pauses. Kale breathed deeply. He focused on the emptiness in his right shoulder, on the hole the prosthetic had left behind. He began to generate silence. Not the mechanical kind, as before, but the kind he had found on the seashore. Deep, salty, eternal. The air around him began to darken. The blue glow of the spire ran into an invisible wall a meter from Kale and went out, turning into gray smoke. Lyra, play. Kale rasped, but not the octave of defense. Play the C. Lyra bit her lip until it bled. The bow moved across the strings differently. Smooth, heavy strokes. The sound of an incoming wave. The rhythm of the surf, which knows no mercy and seeks no harmony. The pontiff screamed. Their foil costumes began to vibrate so violently that they began to cut the skin beneath them. Valeri clutched her own hair, trying to hold on to the slipping melody of the octave. This is impossible. It is merely noise. Savage noise. She shrieked. Kale approached the base of the tower. He pressed his left hand to the black stone, and toward the place of his right, toward that emptiness, he directed all his will. He became the pause. The spire octave shuddered. The blue light within it began to shift in color to a deep, bottomless black. Cracks crept up the monolith from the base upward. Kale felt his heart slowing. One beat every 10 seconds. One every 30. He was going away together with the spire. Kale, stop. Lyra threw down her violin and rushed him. You'll go to zero. Come back. But he could not come back. He was a lock that had snapped shut on the chain of this madness. At that moment, the main resonator at the summit of the tower burst. The enormous crystal weighing a ton shattered to dust. Valeri and the pontiffs were swept away by the blast wave of silence. They did not perish, but their minds, tuned to the eternal song, simply could not withstand the vacuum. They fell onto the sand, staring up at the sky with empty eyes. The spire octave began to collapse inward. Kale stood motionless. His left hand had merged with the stone. He saw Lyra running toward him, saw her lips shouting something, but he no longer heard sounds. For him, the world had become a series of silent frames. Lyra seized him by the shoulder. She began to shake him, pouring into his consciousness the last remnants of her life, her music, her warmth. A flash. Kale collapsed onto the sand. He drew a heavy, wheezing breath of air. Sound returned, but it was not a hum or a song. It was the sound of crumbling stone. The spire octave had turned into a mountain of black sand. Kale lay on his back, looking at the crimson sky that was already beginning to lighten before his eyes. Lyra sat beside him, pressing his head to her knees. You are here, she whispered. You came back. Kale looked at his right shoulder. The scars no longer glowed. They had become simply scar tissue. He slowly sat up. He turned to his companions. Gorn and the other listeners were slowly rising from their knees. The bodies lying on the sand began to stir. People who had frozen in the melody of oblivion were opening their eyes. They were alive. Kale looked at Valeri. She was sitting on the sand, examining her hands as though seeing them for the first time. It no longer sings, she said quietly. She looked at Kale. The silence is so loud, Kale. Kale rose, leaning on Lyra. He approached the pile of black sand that had once been a spire. He picked up a handful, let it seep through his fingers. This is not the end, He gestured to Lyra. The other towers. They felt this. Lyra picked up her violin. The strings had survived. Let them feel it, she said. Now I know how to speak with them. They set off on the return journey. But now they did not walk alone. Hundreds of rescued people, former slaves of the octave, began to follow them. They walked slowly, supporting each other. After a day's travel, they met the first handcar. These were people from the Jericho, those who had stayed in the settlement. They were bringing water and food. Kale sat on the edge of the handcar, looking at the receding horizon. His left hand gripped Lyra's hand. He knew that ahead lay many more spires, that the Sound Council would not give up so easily, that the world was still shattered into pieces. But as long as he felt the warmth of Lyra's palm and heard the creak of the wheels on the rusty rails, he knew the music of this world now belonged to them. And in that music, there would be much silence. Real, living. 3 days' journey remained to the sea. The handcar rolled along the chipped rails, beating out a ragged, honest rhythm. Kale sat on the edge, his legs dangling in the dust. His left shoulder ached. The phantom pains from the absent prosthetic had been replaced by a real, pulling ache in the muscles. Lyra sat beside him. She was tightening the pegs on a violin. The cracked body of the instrument she had sealed with tree resin, and now the violin smelled of forest and char. Behind them, stretched out for a mile, walked people, those who had come to from the octave. They looked like sleepwalkers seeing their hands without gloves for the first time. Valeri trudged at the very end of the column. She was no longer shouting. She simply looked at her feet, her fingers moving through the air as though still searching for the invisible strings of the tower. Kale, Lyra called. She was not looking at him, only at the horizon where the sky was turning from crimson to dusty pink. If the octave was a protection, what was it protecting against? Kale pressed his palm to the vibrating metal of the handcar. He closed his eyes. In his mind, where the interface of the system had once pulsed, only a quiet ripple remained. But this ripple was strange. It did not come from the spires. It came from beneath the ground, a deep, infrasonic rumble, as though something enormous was stirring in the bowels of the planet, awakened by the fall of the tower. He gestured to Lyra. Listen to the ground. She dropped to her knees right on the moving platform. She pressed her ear to the steel surface. Her face went pale in an instant. This is not music, she whispered. This is machinery. Kale. The spires were not simply antennas. They were fuses. At that moment, the earth ahead heaved upward. It was not an explosion. It was a shift. The railway bed arched upward. The rails snapped with a piercing ring, flying apart in steel splinters. The handcar braked sharply, metal grinding against stone. Kale was thrown onto the embankment. He jumped up, shaking off the dust. Lyra fell beside him, pressing the violin to her chest. From the fissure in the earth, something began to rise. It was not a spire. It was a limb, a massive, segmented joint of white, bone-like polymer and oily pistons. It was the size of a train car. Then a second appeared, a third. The sleepers flashed through Kale's mind. Those about whom legends spoke in whispers. The true masters of technology. They had not perished 300 years ago. They had slept in acoustic anabiosis, maintained by the network of spires. By destroying the octave, Kale had pulled the pin from a grenade that had been waiting for its moment for centuries. The creature rose to its full height. It resembled a spider, but with a humanoid torso devoid of a face. Instead of a head, it had an enormous, porous bell that began to slowly rotate, scanning the space. The sound it produced was not heard by the ears, but Kale felt his bones begin to resonate. Every cell of his body trembled, trying to come apart. Status. Sector Guardian Awakening suddenly flashed in Kale's consciousness. The old interface tattoo on his neck lit up with toxic neon. Protocol. Clearing territory of noise interference. The interference was them. People. The Guardian swung its bell toward the column of refugees. The air before it began to compress into a visible lens. Lyra, play everything you have. Kale cried out. He rushed forward, straight toward the fissure. He had no weapon, No right hand, but he had the void. He focused on the scars on his shoulder. If the nanothreads were still there, if they fed on his neural energy, let them feed. He opened all the floodgates inside himself. The Guardian fired. A concentrated wave of ultrasound that should have turned the people into a bloody mist. Kale jumped into its path. He did not raise a shield. He became a funnel. The sound strike hit him. Kale was thrown backward. He flew 10 meters, plowing the ground with his back. But the wave went no further. It was sucked into his body, tearing muscles, breaking ribs, but not touching those who stood behind him. His left hand clenched convulsively. From the scars on his right shoulder, thin threads of pure light, fine as hair, began to grow. They wove together in the air, forming a ghostly, flickering outline of a prosthetic. Mode. Emergency harpoon, the mechanical voice rasped in his brain. Kale's phantom hand elongated, turning into a whip of antimatter. He swung it, and the glowing thread lassoed the bell of the Guardian. Kale felt the connection. A powerful stream of data from the depths of the planet struck his consciousness. He saw archives. He saw how these machines had built the world, how they had decided that people were too chaotic an element, producing too much excess noise. The spires had been their lullaby. Lyra began to play. Her music wove into Kale's glowing threads. She was not fighting the machine, she was introducing a virus into its system. The song of the sea. The chaotic, unpredictable rhythm of living water. The Guardian began to jerk. Its pistons started firing out of sequence. The bell emitted a series of choking clicks. Now, Lyra cried. Kale yanked the phantom thread toward himself. He did not want to destroy the Guardian. He wanted to rewrite it. He poured all his memories into the machine. The cold of snow, the taste of dried fish, the smell of Lyra's hair, the weight of a sledgehammer in his hand. All the noise that the sleepers had considered garbage, Kale turned into code. The Guardian froze. The bell stopped rotating. Something clicked inside the machine. The enormous creature slowly lowered itself onto its joints. The white polymer began to dull, covering itself with cracks resembling wrinkles. From the porous head of the creature, instead of lethal sound, came a quiet, almost tender sigh. Interference. Accepted. Rustled through the air. The Guardian froze, turning into a white stone statue. Its mechanisms merged with the soil, becoming part of the terrain. Kale collapsed on his sand. The phantom hand dissolved, leaving only smoldering scars. He was breathing heavily, feeling the taste of copper in his mouth. Lyra ran to him, fell to her knees, feeling his face with her hands. "You're insane," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his shoulder. "You nearly became one of them." Kale looked at his hands, the real one and the absent one. "They are waking, Lyra. The whole world. It stands on their backs." He raised his eyes to the people. They stood in a daze. Even Valeri had come closer, gazing at the frozen Guardian with reverent horror. "We cannot go to the sea," Kale gestured. "We need to reach the main resonator. If we don't give them a new command, they will wake everywhere, and then no sea will be enough to drown out their cry." Lyra looked east, where among the haze the outlines of other towers could be made out. "So we go all the way?" she asked. Kale stood up, leaning on her shoulder. "To the very silence," he answered. They did not wait. The column moved on, skirting the white giant that had become their first monument. Ahead lay lands that no one had seen for 300 years. Lands where silence was only a lull before a great storm. They walked 3 days across the bed of a dried sea. Salt crunched underfoot like broken glass. The air here was motionless, suspended in anticipation. The Guardian was left behind, a white mountain on the horizon, but Kale felt its presence in his bones. The nanothreads inside his shoulder pulsed with a quiet, barely perceptible itch. The main resonator was drawing closer. This was not a tower. It was a crack in the Earth's crust, from which a column of pure, white noise erupted. Around the fissure stood concentric circles of black stone, gigantic amphitheaters built for listeners who no longer existed. Kale stopped at the edge of the cliff. Below, in the depths of the glowing chasm, Colossal gears of liquid light rotated. Every gear a decade. Every tooth a human life. "This is the heart," Lyra whispered. She pressed her palm to her throat. The sound here was so dense it could be touched. The music of the spheres turned into industrial hum. From the shadows of the amphitheater, people emerged. There were few of them, no more than a dozen. They wore neither the gold of pontiffs nor the rags of listeners. They were dressed in simple gray overalls that blended with the rocks. "Keepers of the Pause," said the oldest among them. He had no eyes. In place of them, 2 small tuning forks had been implanted into his sockets. "We have waited for you, Mute, or for whoever would come in your place." Kale took a step forward. His left hand instinctively moved to the handle of his knife. But he immediately let go. Steel was powerless here. "Why?" he asked by gesture. The old man tilted his head. He was listening to the vibration of the air. "The world is a song that has gone on too long," he said. The sleepers did not wish harm. They wanted order. But order without chaos is death. "We are here to ensure that the melody does not break off. But you have brought with you the silence of the sea. It is contagious, Kale." The old man pointed to the fissure. "If you enter there, you will be able to issue a new command. You will be able to lull the sleepers to sleep forever. But then the world will become ordinary, quiet, gray. There will be no magic of sound in it, no healing sounds, only cold wind and hard labor. Are you prepared to kill a god in order to become simply a man?" Kale looked at Lyra. She was looking at him, and in her eyes he saw the reflection of the white flame of the resonator. "I already killed the god within me when I cut off my arm," he answered by gesture. Lyra came to him. She took his left hand. "I will play the final note, Kale, the one after which silence falls." They began to descend into the fissure. The keepers of the pause did not hinder them. They simply stood in the tears, like silent judges of an ancient proceeding. The lower they descended, the hotter it became. Sound was turning into heat. The walls of the fissure were covered with inscriptions, the code of the creators. Kale saw their blueprints of the Jericho, diagrams of the spires, and his own face. He had been part of the plan, a variable built into the system in case of its overheating. They reached the platform above the very center of the rotating light. Kale stood on the edge. The nano threads in his shoulders stretched out, wove into a blazing phantom outline. This time the hand was not transparent. It was black, like the deepest night. Lyra raised her violin. She pressed the bow to the strings. This was not the sea. This was not noise. This was the cry of a newborn, the first sound of life that knows no rules. Kale jumped. He did not fall into the light. He hung suspended in the center of the resonator, held by the threads of his phantom prosthetic. The black hand plunged into the liquid flame. The white light began to rapidly darken, to be absorbed into his pores. Data flooded into him. Millions of years of history. A map of every nerve cell of every person on Earth. He saw how the sleepers had created people from dust and sound. He saw the error, a tiny spot of silence in the code, which was the soul. Kale clenched his fist inside the core. Directive, full reset, thundered in his consciousness. Switching to manual control. The light in the fissure flickered and went out. The enormous gears slowed, spewing sheaves of sparks. They stopped with a grinding screech. Silence struck the world, like a forge hammer. Across the entire continent, the spires began to settle, to turn into ordinary heaps of stone. The sleepers in their underground cradles froze forever. They were becoming fossils of a new era. Kale was thrown onto the platform. He lay motionless. The phantom hand had vanished. It had taken with it the last remnants of the system. The nano threads had burned out. They had left on his shoulder only deep, blackened furrows. Lyra fell beside him. She could not play. The strings on the violin had snapped simultaneously. The world grew quiet, completely quiet. Kale raised himself on his elbow. He looked upward. The white column of light had disappeared. Above the fissure now was visible an ordinary night sky. The stars no longer flickered in time with the gull. They simply shone. The keepers of the pause and the tears began to slowly disperse. The old man with the tuning forks paused for a moment. He looked down with his empty sockets and gave an almost imperceptible nod. His work was done. Cale shifted his gaze to Lyra. She was smiling. "Do you hear it?" she asked. Cale listened. It was the sound of her breathing, the sound of pebbles crumbling in the depths of the fissure, the sound of blood beating in his own temples. It was life without echo. They came up to the surface several hours later. The group of refugees and Gorn were waiting for them above. Valeri was sitting on a stone. She was looking at her palms, from which the gold paint had worn away. "Is it all over?" asked Gorn. His voice sounded unnaturally loud in the new silence. Cale nodded. He took Lyra by the hand. They walked away from the resonator, westward, toward the sea. The journey took a week. The world was changing before their eyes. The dust had settled. The sky had turned a piercing blue. Birds that had previously flown in silence began to produce first, clumsy trills. When they reached the shore, Cale saw that the lighthouse was still burning. But now it was simply a fire, an ordinary campfire that pointed the way home. They began to descend into the bay, but Cale suddenly froze. His left ear, an ordinary human ear, caught a strange sound. It was not the gull, not the wind. It was a mechanical clatter, rhythmic, growing. From the direction of the horizon, from behind a veil of fog over the water, lights appeared. Bright, electric ones. From a fog, a ship emerged. Enormous. Steel. Its decks were lined with antennas that did not resemble spires. They were rotating, scanning the shore. "Lyra," Cale said quietly. "Look." She raised her eyes. Her face went still. On the side of the ship, an inscription blazed. The letters were foreign, but Cale read them. In an instant, the remnants of the system in his brain fired one last time. Expeditionary Corps. Sector A1. Restoration. From the deck of the ship, small flying drones rose into the air. They buzzed like insects, circling the bay, scanning the people, the camp, the lighthouse. One of the drones hovered directly before Cale's face. Its lens flashed red. Biological anomaly detected. The drone pronounced in a metallic voice. "Subject, Cale. Status, damage carrier. Forced evacuation required for memory defragmentation." Cale slowly reached for his knife. "No, Cale," Lyra grabbed his arm. "Look at the sea." Behind the first ship, dozens of others were emerging from the fog. An entire fleet. The silence they had created in the resonator had been a signal. The world had not merely stopped. It had called those who had been waiting beyond the ocean, those who had preserved the technology, and who had now come for their property. Lyra raised the violin. Even with broken strings, she pressed it to her shoulder. "This is not yet the end," she said. Cale looked at the fleet, at the drone, then at his people in the bay. He understood. The spires had been not only a prison, they had been a shield. They had created noise that made this continent invisible to the outside world. Now the shield was gone. Cale gripped the handle of his knife. His one hand did not tremble. "We will not become their variables." He gestured to Lyra. On the shore, landing craft began to disembark. Soldiers in heavy armor, with weapons that did not fire sound. They fired lead. Cale took a step forward, toward the first boat. Cale stood at the water's edge. Cold water washed over his boots. Ahead, a couple of 100 meters away, the heavy ramps of landing craft struck the sand. From the bellies of the machines, figures emerged. Gray Kevlar, sealed helmets with narrow lens slits. On their shoulders, insignia in the form of a crossed-out circle. These were not priests of sound. These were soldiers of order. Lyra stood beside him. She was not trying to play. She simply held the broken violin like a shield. "Object 702, came a voice from the nearest craft. Loud, amplified by speakers. "Remain in place. Any sudden movement will be interpreted as aggression. You are subject to seizure for sector data restoration." Cale slowly raised his left hand. Not to surrender. He simply felt how, in his empty right shoulder, the itch had arisen again. A short, angry tingling. "They think I'm a database," he thought. The first armored soldier stepped onto the sand. In his hands was a carbine with a short barrel. He walked with confidence. His boots left deep prints in the soft ground. For him, this Earth was simply a piece of map to be cleared. "Stand back," Kale said hoarsely. His voice failed him, breaking into a mechanical clank. The soldier did not stop. He raised the carbine, aiming at Kale's chest. Seizure procedure initiated. "Comply, carrier." At that moment, Kale closed his eyes. He was not searching for the gull of the spires. He was searching for that black vacuum that had swallowed the resonator. Within him, a particle of that void still beat. A tiny point of absolute zero. He pulled that point toward himself. The scars on his shoulder split. But instead of light, darkness burst from them. A dense, oily substance that did not flow downward but spiraled, forming a ghostly, distorted semblance of a claw. Kale lunged. He was faster than any mechanism. A fraction of a second. He was before the soldier. The black claw entered the Kevlar of the chest plate as easily as wet cardboard. A dry crack was heard. The electronics in the soldier's helmet short-circuited. The lenses went dark. The armored figure went limp and crashed into an oncoming wave. "Fire!" came a command from the craft. Lead sang in the air. It was a sound Kale was not accustomed to. Sharp, whistling, tearing flesh. "Take cover!" Gorn shouted somewhere behind, leading people behind the rocks. Lyra fell onto the sand, covering her head with her hands. Kale remained standing. Bullets entered his black phantom hand and lodged there, losing momentum, turning into flattened pieces of metal. He felt every bullet. Each one took a particle of his life, feeding the darkness in his shoulder. He raised the black hand toward the craft. From his palm burst not sound. It was an anti-impulse, a wave of silence of such density that the air before it turned to ice. The craft shuddered. The steel hull was covered with frost. The engines stalled, choking on their own vibration. The soldiers on deck froze, clutching their throats. The silence was burning the oxygen in their lungs. "Kale, stop!" Lyra cried out through the roar of the surf. "You're becoming one of them. Look at yourself." Kale looked down. The darkness from his shoulder was beginning to creep across his chest. His skin was turning gray, like obsidian. His face was stiffening, becoming a mask resembling the visage of a sleeping guardian. He was losing his humanity. In order to save people, he was turning into the machine he himself had destroyed. The drones in the sky began to dive at him, one after another. Suicidal attacks. Explosions rocked the shore. Sand flew up in black fountains. Kale stood in the center of this hell. He saw the main forces of the fleet approaching the shore. Hundreds of craft, thousands of soldiers. They had not come to negotiate. They had come to take what they considered theirs. The information locked in his brain. "Lyra," he rasped. His voice had almost entirely become digital noise. "Go to the mountains. Lead them into the forests. They will not find you there without frequency scanners. I will not leave you. You must." He turned to her. One of his eyes was still brown, human. The other glowed with the cold white flame of the resonator. "I will hold them off. I will become their spire." Kale turned to face the sea. He walked into the water up to his waist. The darkness from his shoulder began to expand, merging with the seawater. The surface of the bay began to blacken. He began to broadcast. But it was not a psalm. It was chaos. Kale poured into the fleet's network everything. The cries of the lubricators, the weeping of children in car 702, the crack of breaking ice, Lyra's whisper in the night. Millions of disordered, living, dirty data flooded into the ship's systems. Screens on the flagship's bridges began to explode. Navigation computers were going insane. Ships began to collide with each other, losing control. "Catch it," Kale whispered, sinking deeper. Choke on this silence. He felt the sea accepting him, felt water filling his mechanical heart. On the shore, the soldiers of order retreated in horror. Their communications were dead. Their weapons were failing. They had encountered something that defied logic. A living void. Lyra stood on the dune. She watched as the figure of Kale slowly dissolved in the black water, turning into an enormous, swaying vortex of shadows. "Kale," she whispered, pressing the violin to her heart. The fleet began to turn around. They were fleeing, leaving their landing troops on the shore. leaving this accursed continent that had learned to bite back. The black vortex in the center of the bay began to subside. The darkness settled to the bottom. An hour later, the sea turned blue again. The shore was washed with wreckage from the landing craft. And silence. Lyra ran down to the very edge of the water. She searched for him, called out, but the only answer was the steady sound of the waves. She found him 100 meters from the camp. He lay on the wet sand where the water barely touched his face. The black skin had disappeared. The scars on his shoulder were clean and pink. He looked like an ordinary man, exhausted, broken, but a man. Kale opened his eyes. He looked at the sky for a long time. Are they gone? He asked, barely audibly. Gone. Lyra took his hand. You drove them away. Kale tried to smile. Now we are truly alone. He sat up, leaning on her shoulder. His left hand was trembling. On the shore, Gorn and the others were disarming the remaining soldiers. They surrendered without a fight, removing their helmets and breathing in the salty air with surprise. For them, the war was also over. Kale looked at the horizon. The fleet had disappeared into the fog. They will come back, he said. Not today, and not tomorrow, but they will come back. Lyra nodded. She held out her violin to him. Let them come back. Now we know that silence is also a weapon. Kale took the violin. He ran his finger along the crack in the soundboard. We need to build not only houses, Lyra. We need to build walls. He stood up. His legs were trembling, but he held himself upright. In the sky above the bay, a bird was circling. An ordinary gull. It cried loudly, harshly, defiantly. Kale listened to its cry and smiled. It was the best sound of his life. The shore was being washed with fragments of Kevlar and white plastic from the drones. The soldiers of Order, abandoned by their fleet, were sitting on the sand in groups. They had removed their helmets. Beneath them turned out to be ordinary people, pale, with closely cropped hair and pupils dilated from an excess of sensory information. One of them was crying, examining an ordinary stone. Kale walked slowly past them. His steps were heavy, his left arm hung limply at his side. The darkness had gone, leaving behind only a burned-out void in the nerve endings. Gorn came up to Kale. In his hands, he held a captured rifle, smooth, futuristic, devoid of any elegance. What do we do with them? Gorn nodded toward the prisoners. They killed 3 of ours when they were landing. Kale looked at the near soldier. The man flinched when he met the gaze of the mute's white, lifeless eye. Let them build, Kale gestured. Walls, piers, roads. They have knowledge. We have land. He walked on toward the lighthouse. Lyra followed him like a shadow. She watched as Kale winced with every movement. Inside him, something was still short-circuiting, remnants of hostile code sparking in his synapses. They climbed to the observation platform. The wind here was sharp, saturated with iodine and the char of the burned landing craft. You saw their archives? Lyra said quietly. While you were there, in the water. Who were they? Kale leaned his left elbow on the parapet. They call themselves the Pure, he answered by gesture. They live on artificial island platforms. For them, sound is garbage, an error of evolution. They have transferred everything to digital code. Direct transmission of thoughts. No words, no songs. Is that why they fear us so? Lyra pressed the violin to her chest. For them, we are a virus. Kale looked at his fingers. We produce noise. We are chaotic. We are unpredictable. They came to defragment us, to clear the sector of interference. But they fled. Lyra tried to smile. They retreated for analysis. Kale shook his head. They don't know what to do with the void I poured into them. But they will calculate the algorithm. A month, a year, 10 years. They will return with filters. He fell silent, watching the sun touch the edge of the ocean. The crimson disk looked like molten metal cooling in water. Lyra, he called to her by gesture. She came closer. You need to find other musicians. Not the psalmsingers of the council, but those who play from the heart. In the 400 series cars, there were such people. In the 1000 series, we need to create our own resonance. A defense? No, a language. If we can speak to their machines in the language of life, if we make their systems feel, they will not be able to shoot at us. Lyra nodded. She understood that this was a mad plan, to try to defeat Steel and Code with a violin string. But they had no other way. The Pure would never run out of lead, and their human resources were limited. Night fell. The first night in a world where not a single spire was still working. Kale sat in his hut. He was trying to light a lamp with his left hand, but his fingers would not obey. Suddenly, Lyra's hand covered his palm. She struck a match. Warm yellow light filled the room. I found this in one of the landing craft. She placed a strange object on the table. A flat disc of transparent polymer. One of the prisoners said it was the Harmony Archive, their old data, before they decided to become machines. Kale took the disc. He felt a slight vibration, very faint. He held the disc to his right shoulder, to those very burned furrows where the nanothreads had once been. It connected. Sparks flashed in Kale's eyes. A projection unfolded before him. It was not a blueprint or code. It was a recording of a forest. A real one. Enormous. Thousands of birds were singing simultaneously, creating an incredible, complex polyphony. And people, they were not standing in formation. They were dancing to this sound. Lost protocol detected. JOY, a voice whispered in his head. Kale felt a tear rolling down his cheek. They forgot who they are, he thought. Those who came on the ships. They're the same victims of noise as we are. Only their noise was made of digits and logic. We will show them this. Lyra was looking at the projection with wonder. We will make them remember. At that moment, a cry rang out beyond the door. Kale instantly leapt to his feet, forgetting the pain. He ran outside. Near the very shore, where the prisoners were standing, movement had begun. But it was not a mutiny. One of the prisoner soldiers was on his knees before the lighthouse. He had removed not only his helmet, but all of his upper armor. He was singing. It was terrible, shapeless, rasping. A man who had not used his voice for decades was trying to extract sound from himself. It was a parody of song, but it held so much despair that Gorn, standing nearby with a rifle, lowered the barrel. The other prisoners joined in. First one, then two, 10. It was a mutiny of humanity against algorithm. Kale looked at them and understood the fleet would not return in 10 years. They would return much sooner, to destroy their own infected soldiers. Gorn, Kale gestured the foreman over. Give them shovels. And weapons. Weapons? To prisoners? Gorn's eyes went wide. They're no longer prisoners. Lyra stepped forward. They are witnesses. Kale looked at the sea. There, far beyond the horizon, in the darkness, he felt a pulsation. Cold. Calculated. A new war was beginning. Not over territory and not over resources. It was a war for the right to make sound. Kale picked up a heavy crowbar in his left hand. He walked up to the soldier who was singing and held the tool out to him. Build, said Kale in his new, rasping voice. The soldier nodded, wiping tears with a dirty hand. That night no one in the base slept. People from the train and people from the ships were hauling stones together. They were reinforcing the shore. They were turning the lighthouse into a fortress. And Lyra sat on a rock and played. She was searching for that very note from the Harmony Archive. The note that could stop a bullet. Work continued until dawn. The bay had turned into an enormous construction site, where the steel of the landing craft was being cut into sheets to reinforce the huts. The soldiers of the Pure worked in silence, but with coordination. Their movements were precise, stripped of unnecessary fuss. The habit of algorithms helped them raise fortifications faster than 300 ordinary workers could have done. Kale stood at the base of the lighthouse, watching Gorn distribute assignments. The former foreman of the listeners was now commanding a mixed unit. One of the soldiers, the very one who had been singing in the night, approached Kale. He removed his glove, extending his hand. On his palm was a tattoo, a barcode crossed out by a deep scar. Mark, he said. His voice sounded as though he was swallowing gravel. I was an acoustic technician on the flagship style. Kale nodded. He took Mark by the hand. Kale's left hand was hard as stone. They won't come back for us, Mark continued, looking at the sea. Our code stipulates. Infection is termination of service. For them we are dead, and they will come to confirm it officially. Kale asked by gesture, how much time do we have? Mark looked at the sky. Their orbital jump requires recharging. A day, maybe two. They will not send a fleet. That is too costly. They will send a cleanser. Lyra, sitting nearby on a fragment of a long rod, raised her head. What is that? An autonomous sound virus on a heavy cruiser platform. Mark swallowed. It does not fire bullets. It broadcasts the white death. This is a frequency that causes the water molecules in the body to vibrate until the cells burst. We call it silent boiling. Kale felt how inside his shoulder the cold arose again. That very void that he had absorbed in the resonator responded to the threat. It hungered to swallow the white death. But Kale knew his body would not survive a second such blow. Last time he had barely avoided turning into an obsidian statue. We need a filter. Kale rasped this aloud, startling himself with the sound of his own voice. A large filter. He pointed to the lighthouse. Make it into an antipodal resonator? Mark grasped the idea immediately. His eyes lit up with technical excitement. We can use the plating of the landing craft as reflectors. But we need a source. Someone has to modulate the signal manually. A machine won't manage it. The cleanser will adjust to the algorithm within seconds. Everyone looked at Lyra. She slowly rose. In her hands, she held the violin made of driftwood. I won't be able to overpower an entire cruiser, she said quietly. You don't need to. Kale came to her. He placed his hand on her shoulder. You will be the heart, and I will be the amplifier. Mark began issuing instructions. The soldiers of the Pure were pulling out coils of superconductors and power blocks from the landing craft. Gorn brought out the remains of copper pipes from the boiler room from the train. Within a few hours, the lighthouse was covered with metal ribs, turning into a bizarre semblance of a giant musical instrument. Kale climbed to the very top. There, in a lantern compartment, Mark had assembled a chair from fragments of a pilot's seat. Wires stretched to the armrests. Kale! Mark hesitated before connecting the terminals to the scars on his shoulder. If you do this, there is no way back. Your brain will become part of the circuit. You will feel every sound as a knife blow. Kale simply nodded. He looked down. There on the sand, Lyra was tuning the violin. She raised her head and met his gaze. In her eyes was resolve, mixed with boundless sorrow. I am ready, she called out. At that moment, the horizon trembled. The fog over the ocean began to coil into spirals. From the void, as if from nowhere, a silhouette emerged. It was not a ship in the usual sense. A smooth, coal-black disk, devoid of decks and portholes. It did not sail. It glided a meter above the water, leaving behind a strip of dead, frozen sea. The cleanser. The air suddenly became absolutely motionless. Birds froze in the sky and began to fall into the water like stones. The silence became heavy as lead. Kale felt the first vibration. It was thin as a hair. It pierced his brain, causing a sharp flash of pain. Begin. Mark rasped, closing the contact. Kale was arched backward. Electricity and data flooded through his shoulder into the lighthouse. The metal casing of the tower began to hum. Lyra struck the strings. It was a sharp, wild sound. It swept across the bay, colliding with the invisible wall of the White Death. At the point of collision, the air sparked with ozone. Kale became a conductor. He caught Lyra's signal, passed it through his void, amplified it, and thrust it outward through the lighthouse's antennas. The black disk of the Pure slowed. Its surface began to vibrate, trying to adjust to the rhythm of the violin. But Lyra did not play by the rules. She changed tempo. She wove pauses into the melody, broke the rhythm, shifted to high, almost ultrasonic notes, and dropped sharply into the bass. Come on, Kale cried, feeling his left hand begin to go numb. More chaos. The cleanser answered. A wave of sound of such force that the rocks around the bay began to crack struck the lighthouse. Kale screamed. His eyes blazed with blinding light. He saw the cruiser's code. Billions of lines of perfect logic, and he began to pour Lyra into that code. He poured into the machine the scent of salt water, the feeling of sand between the fingers, the pain of losing an arm, the joy of the first fish caught. The cruiser of the Pure trembled. Its perfect form began to distort. The smooth metal went in waves, as though it was turning into liquid. The system cannot cope with the emotional noise. Mark cried, pressing himself to the floor. It is trying to calculate the meaning of love and is hanging. Suddenly, the cleanser produced a sound resembling the groan of a wounded beast. Its black hull blazed from within with orange flame. It began to list to one side. Lyra took the final, highest note. She held it until the string snapped, slicing her finger open. The cruiser of the Pure crashed into the water. An enormous fountain of spray rose to the sky. The wave reached the shore, washing the feet of the people with warm water. The lighthouse went dark. Cale slumped in his chair. The wires smoked and melted. He felt no pain. He felt nothing at all. Lyra threw down the violin and rushed up the stairs. She burst into the compartment and fell to her knees before him. Cale was looking at her, but his gaze was empty. His left hand was cold. "Cale, no," she whispered. He slowly turned his head. A weak, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his lips. "Do you hear it?" he uttered, barely perceptibly. Lyra listened. Outside, in the bay, the soldiers of order and the people from the train were shouting victory. Together, they were embracing, throwing their hats in the air. It was a discordant, chaotic, deafening noise of life. Cale closed his eyes. He had not died, but the part of him that had been connected to the machines had burned out completely. Now he was simply a human being, truly, without interfaces, without nanothreads, without phantom hands. Several hours later, Mark came up to them. "The cruiser sank," he said, "but it sent a signal before it went down." "And what was in it?" asked Lyra, not releasing Cale's hand. Mark looked at Cale with deep respect. There was no command and no report. There was one single audio file, a recording of your violin, Lyra, and a note from the system, meaning detected. Consigne impossible. Cale opened his eyes. "So, they won't come back?" he asked by gesture. "They won't come back to kill," said Mark. "They will send ambassadors. They will want to know what this meaning is." Cale looked at the sea. Where the cruiser had sunk, the water was still bubbling. The world had changed forever. The era of sound slavery had ended. The era of digital order had been shaken. The era of people was beginning. Cale stood up, leaning on Lyra's shoulder. He stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. Below, the people were lighting an enormous bonfire. They were preparing for a celebration. The first real celebration on this liberated land. Lyra picked up her broken violin. "I will fix it," she said, "and we will write a new song." Cale nodded. He knew there were still many hardships ahead. There would be disputes, there would be illness, there would be new enemies. But now they had a weapon that no machine could withstand. They had a soul expressed in sound. A day had passed since the fall of the cleanser. A heavy smell of ozone and burnt plastic hung over the bay, but the sea was already beginning to swallow the black wreckage of the cruiser. Pieces of anti-gravity plates jutted from the water like the fins of giant sharks. Cale sat on the sand at the very edge of the water. His right shoulder, stripped of nano threads, no longer itched. It was felt simply as a part of his body, quiet, empty, and at last healed. The red lines of the interface no longer surfaced in his mind. The code had fallen silent. Mark came up to him, carrying in his hands a strange device resembling a glass tablet. His face was pale, but his eyes shone with a feverish gleam. "Cale," he sat down on the sand beside him. The signal that left the cruiser. It didn't just reach their headquarters. It triggered a cascade. Cale asked by gesture, "What does that mean?" "It means that the Pure are no longer unified." Mark ran his finger across the screen, unfolding a hologram. "Your emotional injection passed through their closed networks. Dozens of platforms in the ocean are now in quarantine mode. Soldiers are removing helmets. Technicians are switching off filters. They have begun to hear." Lyra came out of the hut. She was carrying a cup of hot herbal infusion in her hands. Her fingers were bandaged, the violin strings had left deep cuts. "Is this victory?" she asked, handing the cup to Cale. "This is a split," Mark answered. "Those who were infected are now outcasts, and those who preserve their logic are furious. They are preparing the final note." Cale raised his head sharply. He knew this term from the depths of the Resonator's archive. It was a self-destruction protocol for the planetary acoustic network. If the Pure understood that they were losing control over humanity, they would launch a resonance of such power that the Earth's crust would simply crack. "Where's the control panel?" Kale rasped aloud. His voice still sounded like the grinding of stones. "Not a control panel." Mark pointed north, in the direction of the distant icy wastelands. "The orbital station Zenith is connected to the spires by invisible beams. The only way to stop the protocol is to send a response signal directly there. But we have no transmitter of that power. The lighthouse burned out." Kale looked at Lyra, then at Mark, then at his hands. "There's one." He gestured. "The Jericho." Mark frowned. "The train? But that is a heap of rust. Its engines are dead, its resonators dismantled into plows." "Not all of it." Kale stood up. "In Car 1, beneath the Pontiff's armor, there is a reserve communication crystal. It runs on the energy of memory decay. If we gather everyone who remembers the noise." Lyra understood him first. "We will create a collective resonance. Not one violin, thousands of voices. The whole train will become one enormous antenna." "This is suicide," Mark whispered. "If the frequency of Zenith strikes back, the Jericho will turn into a mass grave." Kale looked at the settlement. Children were playing in the sand with drone fragments. Gorn was teaching a former soldier to chop wood. Valeri was mending nets, humming something to herself. "We are already dead if we don't try." Kale answered by gesture. They began preparing immediately. The whole settlement came into motion. People loaded the remains of electronics from the landing craft onto homemade carts. Mark and the former technicians of the Pure were pulling intact capacitors from the sunken cruiser. The journey to the Jericho took 2 days. When they saw the 40-kilometer steel serpent frozen in the sands, silence fell. The train looked majestic and pitiful at the same time. "To work," Gorn commanded. Kale descended into the very belly of the locomotive. Here, in the darkness, it smelled of oil and eternity. He found a panel of Car 1. Hidden beneath layers of dust and gold was the crystal Pure, transparent, the size of a human head. "Mark, connect it," Kale commanded by gesture. "I need all the people, all 700 of them, to line up along the train." Mark was connecting cables with trembling hands. They must touch the plating, and they must remember the most powerful moments of their lives. Pain, joy, fear, love. We need pure psychic energy. Kale stepped out onto the roof of the locomotive. Lyra stood beside him. She had repaired her violin, stringing thin copper threads from the cruiser's wiring in place of the broken strings. "Ready?" she asked. Kale nodded. He placed his left palm on the metal of the Jericho, warmed by the sun. The people below formed a living chain. Gorn took a little girl by the hand. Valeri stood beside Mark. The soldiers of the Pure stood in line alongside the lubricators. 40 kilometers of people touching one giant piece of iron. "Begin," Mark cried out. The crystal inside the car blazed crimson. Kale felt the blow. It was not pain. It was an ocean. Thousands of lives flooded into his consciousness. He felt the taste of the first bread that Gorn had eaten after the victory. He felt Valeri's cold fury. He felt Lyra's tenderness. The whole Jericho began to vibrate. Rust fell from the cars in clouds of brown dust. The air around the train trembled, turning into a lens. In the sky, directly above them, a bright point flashed. Zenith had activated. The orbital strike was beginning to form. The sky turned deep blue-black. "Lyra!" Kale cried out. She began to play, but it was not chaos. It was a hymn, powerful, solemn, uniting all 700 voices into a single stream. Kale directed this stream upward. From the locomotive of the Jericho, a column of transparent light struck the sky. It was neither sound nor laser. It was the living memory of the planet. 2 beams met in the stratosphere. The black beam of Zenith and the bright beam of Jericho. For a moment, it seemed time had stopped. The earth beneath people's feet began to hum, but no one let go of their neighbor's hand. Kale felt his consciousness stretching across 40 kilometers. He saw every rivet, every bolt. He saw how Zenith tried to suppress them, how its algorithms burned up, colliding with the force of human experience. Stronger. Kale rasped. Remember everything. At that moment, Kale saw in Zenith not an enemy. He saw their captive mind, the artificial intelligence of the station, which was also a slave of the pure. He did not destroy the station. He opened its floodgates. He poured into Zenith everything. All the warmth of the campfires, all of Lyra's songs, all the forgiveness he felt toward Valeri. The orbital point flickered. The black beam suddenly turned white. Station Zenith received the data, and it made its choice. A flash blinded everyone. When Kale opened his eyes, the sky was clear. The star of Zenith was slowly moving beyond the horizon, but now it did not threaten. It was broadcasting to all platforms of the pure a single phrase. Protocol changed. Cleansing canceled. Life recognized as the highest form of order. Kale fell to his knees. His left hand was smoking. Lyra fell beside him, breathing heavily. The violin in her hands crumbled to dust. It had not withstood such resonance. The people along the train began to slowly release each other's hands. They were weeping. They were laughing. They were exhausted, but they knew now they were truly free, even from the fear of space. Did we do it? Lyra whispered. Kale looked at his palms. We gave them a reason not to kill us. He answered by gesture. Mark climbed out of the locomotive hatch. His face was radiant. The station has switched to archive mode. He cried out. The pure. They are retreating to their poles. They will no longer interfere. They are frightened by what we showed them. Kale stood up, leaning on Lyra's shoulder. He looked at the endless serpent of the Jericho. The train had fulfilled its final task. It was no longer a machine of war or flight. It had become a monument. Let's go home, Kale gestured. They moved back toward the sea. Behind them in the desert, the Jericho remained. Over the years, sand would cover it, and it would become part of the landscape. But the legend of how 700 people stopped the wrath of the heavens with a rusty train and one violin would live forever. Kale walked across the sand, feeling the wind on his face. He no longer needed to absorb noise. He no longer needed to create silence. He simply lived. The journey from the Jericho to the coast took 3 days. But these were different days. People were not merely walking, they were communicating. Those who for decades had exchanged only brief gestures or listener codes were now trying to find words. The air of the wasteland, which had previously vibrated from the static tension of the spires, now seemed transparent and fragile. Kale walked at the head of the column. His left shoulder, burned during the communication session with Zenith, was tightly bandaged with pieces of canvas. Every step sent a dull pain through him, but it was a tangible, earthly pain. Lyra walked beside him, carefully carrying the fragments of her violin in a cloth bag. We left them back there, she said quietly, glancing at the barely visible silhouette of the train in the haze. 700 people who touch space. Do you feel it, Kale? He stopped. He closed his eyes. Inside him, there was no longer any gull, nor was there the icy void that had nearly swallowed him in the bay. Only a faint echo remained like the aftertaste of storm. He gestured. We are no longer parts of a mechanism. We are the echo of ourselves. When they came out to the crest of the last dune, the bay opened up before them. But it changed. At the pier, there were not only the settlers' boats and the wreckage of landing craft. There rocked on the waves a white, streamlined shuttle. It had no engines in the conventional sense. It seemed to hover several inches above the water, held by a magnetic field. On the sand, surrounded by Gorn and armed workers, stood 3 figures. They were tall, in thin silvery suits that seemed like a second skin. Their faces were open, but without expression. Their eyes were solid mirrored lenses. The pure, Mark whispered, stepping out from behind Kale's back. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster, but Kale stopped him with a movement of his palm. One of the newcomers took a step forward. He did not open his mouth, but sound rang out directly in the air before them, a clean, overtone-free, synthesized voice. Carrier Kale, Operator Lyra, Technician Mark. We have not come for defragmentation. Kale came up close to them. His one brown eye met the mirrored lens of the newcomer. Why? He rasped. His voice was gradually returning, though it still resembled the crackle of dry branches. "Station Zenith broadcast your archive," the Pure One said. His head tilted slightly, as though he was analyzing the chemical composition of the sweat on Kale's face. "Our society has encountered a logical paradox. 82% of our citizens experienced a system failure upon listening to the audiophile violin. We have classified this as forced empathy. We cannot continue the cleansing program until we understand the nature of this noise." Lyra stepped forward, taking from the bag a fragment of the neck of her violin. "This is not noise," she said. "This is what makes us alive. You erased this within yourselves 300 years ago. We optimize survival," the Pure One countered. "But now our algorithms predict stagnation. You have brought chaos that generates interest." The newcomer extended his hand. On his palm lay a small black cube. "This is a key to the archives of the sleepers. They contain blueprints not only of weapons, but of what you call instruments. We propose an exchange. We give you technologies for soil restoration and water purification. You give us data about your feelings." Kale looked at the cube. It was a temptation. With this thing, they could turn the wasteland into a flourishing garden in a single season. No hunger, no salt in the lungs. But he also saw how Mark looked greedily at the device, saw how Gorn gripped his rifle. He gestured to Lyra. "They want to buy our silence with their machines." Lyra nodded. She understood. If they accepted this, they would become part of a system again. Perhaps a softer, more comfortable one, but still a system. Kale took the cube. It was cold and heavy. He looked at the newcomer, then at the lighthouse, then at the people who had crowded on the shore, dirty, exhausted, but free for the first time in centuries. Kale swung his arm and hurled the cube into the sea. The black point disappeared in the waves with a short splash. The Pure Ones froze in unison. Their lenses flashed red for a moment, an automatic reaction to an illogical action. "Why?" the newcomer's voice asked. "This would have accelerated your development by 500 years. "We don't need your blueprints," said Kale, and this time his voice sounded firm. "We will learn to build ourselves. We will find our own songs ourselves. Leave. Tell your people that we are not an object for analysis. We are different." The Pure One was silent for a long time. The magnetic field beneath his shuttle began to pulse more strongly, whipping up foam. "The logic of this action is inaccessible," he said, "but the result has been recorded. We will observe. From a distance. No more gull broadcasts. This sector is declared a free zone of interference." The shuttle smoothly turned and began to accelerate, disappearing into the fog. A minute later, nothing remained on the horizon but a white stripe of foam. Gorn came up to Kale. "You just threw our future into the water, lad. We could have built cities. We will build them, Gorn." Kale put his hand on his shoulder. "With our own hands, so that they don't crumble when someone in orbit presses the off button." Lyra sat down on the sand and began laying out the fragments of her violin. "I need wood. Good, dry wood. Mark, do you have any glue?" "I'll find something in the wreckage of the landing craft." Mark smiled. "I think I can put together for you not just a violin, but something resonant." Evening fell over the bay. Bonfires blazed on the shore again. But now people were not merely warming themselves. A group of former listeners was trying to tap out a rhythm on empty fuel barrels. The soldiers of the Pure who had remained in the settlement were showing them how to modulate sound by striking different parts of the metal. Kale sat on the porch of his hut. He was looking at the stars. They were no longer for him a map of zenith or network nodes. They were simply stars. Suddenly from the darkness came a sound. Discordant, tentative, but absolutely pure. Lyra had drawn the first string taut on her new, roughly made violin. She drew the bow across it. One note. It cut through the silence of the night, reflected off the rocks, and went out to sea. Kale smiled.